Well, good morning and welcome to the most exciting panel discussion you're going to have from the previous 2 days and for the rest of the day as well. My name's Steve Krieg and I'm very proud to say that I'm the Mayor of Lismore, and it's a wonderful spot. People always get to Coffs and say, oh, how good's this? Drive another 2 hours north and you get to God's own country. And so a disaster waiting to happen. Interesting topic for me, being the Mayor of Lismore. As you would no doubt be aware, 2022, Lismore experienced the biggest flood in our recorded history and the most costly flood, or the most costly disaster, I should say, in Australia's history. And that figure is not said lightly. That's the Insurance Council of Australia's number. We're at about 6.5 billion and climbing. There's still a lot of assessments that are yet to be undertaken. So it was a pretty major disaster that we dealt with in the Northern Rivers. And I've been accused by my 6 neighbouring councils, who all form our joint organisation, that it's become Lismore-centric. I make no apology for that. I'm the Mayor of Lismore, not the Mayor of the Northern Rivers, and I am very proud of my city and where I live, but the flooding did affect the Northern Rivers. Ballina, Byron, even Kyogle up in the hills experienced a certain degree of flooding, and the Richmond Valley and Clarence as well. So it was a very widespread disaster that will have implications for the Northern Rivers for the next decade at least. Why am I here? I don't know. I am a small business owner. I've owned a cafe restaurant for 16 years. Lismore, university town, agricultural town, and basically, sadly, a declining town in a lot of respects. And so a group of us got together and decided to either put up or shut up. And we put up and we put a team together, and we actually, for the first time in history, got a majority group on our council, 6 out of the 11 seats. And the rumour was that I had the least amount of dirt to be exposed, which is why they put me up as the Mayor. Interesting philosophy, but here I am, and it's great to be here. We are joined by an outstanding panel today, and I don't want to make this about Lismore necessarily or about what I've been up against, but it's all about these people on the stage. And I'm technologically illiterate, but I'm going to pass the microphone and hope for the best. So I'll get these people to introduce themselves very briefly and about where they are and what they've come from before we get into the nuts and bolts of how to cope with a disaster. So first up, Tracy.
Tracy Chalk. There's a flash new title up there, Head of Waste and Resource Recovery Penrith, as of last week, I think. If you do know me, you'll know me as the Manager of Resource Recovery in Penrith. Penrith too is a river city, and we have had our share of disasters, nothing at all like Lismore. And I have to say that before passing the mic on, I actually disagree with Steve straight up. I think, in fact, probably the majority of our audience today would love to hear a lot more about Lismore and what was experienced there. But I'm very happy to answer any other questions that might come about.
And Tanya.
Hi, yes, I'm Principal at MRA Consulting Group. I came in on the flood recovery program, working with the EPA. Took over as project manager towards the end of that program, but MRA were engaged as project manager for the land-based cleanup program. And so I helped pull together the reporting and was just amazed by the complexity, I guess, of the cleanup operations and the level of engagement required to do that sort of operations. So, yeah.
Thanks, Tanya. Mike, welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Mike Haywood. I originate from Adelaide. I'm currently residing in Sydney, but I was part of the team that cleaned up after the 2019 actually in Adelaide, but 2020 in Kangaroo Island and a few other area bushfires in South Australia. I also helped do the cleanup of the 2017 floods in Two Wells, Virginia, which was nothing like Lismore, but it was still a reasonable job. Gave me a taste of what you guys are going through. I helped write the scoping document. We had a CEO, just 2 seconds, yeah? We had a CEO of Green Industries SA, Vaughan Levitsky, who went to India after one of their major disaster events and came back thinking, I need to have a disaster plan, waste management disaster plan. So with the wonderful team at Rawtech, I was part of a group that helped write the scoping and then put the actual next stage, which was the disaster waste management plan together. And then in January of 2020, I was called into a meeting and walked out, being the guy that was going to implement that plan. So interesting times. Thank you.
And then we have Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan MacDonald. I work for the Hunter Joint Organisation. We represent 11 councils in the Hunter region, from as far north as Mid-Coast and far south as Central Coast. I'm currently heading up a project, Disaster Risk Resilience Fund project, helping to prepare those councils for disaster waste as a region, so doing it through a regional lens, because obviously disasters don't contain themselves to LGAs. So we're trying to look together on how we can best prepare. We've also done a disaster waste management plan, and the stage we're at now is we're trying to identify temporary sites that we're hopefully going to try and pilot to get them pre-approved, ready to be stood up in a disaster event. So that's where we're at in the Hunter JL.
Thanks, Susan. And finally, from the organisation we all love and know very well, the EPA. Thanks, Christy.
Morning, everyone. I lead up the Recovery and Resilience programs at the New South Wales EPA. So I suppose we cover a few facets. We stood up some teams in response to the bushfires, unprecedented bushfires in 2019 and 2020, and we run recovery programs post those bushfires, and then with repeat flooding in 2021 and 2022. So I think we've delivered 18 programs in response to those disasters. We also work in the resilience space, implementing actions under the Climate Change Action Plan. And finally, we have a lead role in emergency management as the sponsoring agency for the Environmental Services Functional Area, which means, I suppose, when there's environmental impacts in disasters, we coordinate across agencies to get quick response and then recovery to those environmental impacts, including waste, which is a really important part. So I think that kind of sums up the role.
Thank you very much. So an outstanding panel to drill down and ask lots of questions when the opportunity arises. Do you want me to hold that?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Because I hate standing behind things. I'm a little bit more hands-on. So I'm going to use this microphone and just tell you a little bit about Lismore's lived experience. And funnily enough, our staff, for whatever reason, and I don't know why, installed a time-lapse camera at our waste cell 3 days before the flood hit. So I've actually got a little video to show, and I don't know if you guys can press play on it from up here, or I have to press a button. So this is actual time-lapse photography. You can see down the bottom, maybe the date, 25th of the 2nd. Yeah, sure. The panel might want to see this. We might play it a couple of times. It's that exciting at a waste conference. So 28th February 2022 was when Lismore went underwater. This is our waste cell, as I said. And we built, like Penrith, like a lot of river cities, we know Lismore floods. This particular site is protected to a height of 12.5 metres. So previous flood, record flood height was 12.4 in 1974. And so when you talk about disaster preparedness, Lismore thought we were pretty good. You know, you've got that little bit of freeboard above the previous maximum flood height. But as you can see, 14.5 metres was something that Lismore was not ready for and was not prepared for. That's our waste cell, and as you can probably guess, there hasn't been a lot of work gone into the repair of that at the moment due to a number of different reasons, one of them being money and the fact that we've virtually got to rebuild our whole waste facility from the ground up, probably at a cost of around 12 million. So it's an ongoing project, and as we all know, money doesn't flow as fast as it probably should. So we're in the design stage of what our waste facility will look like into the future. A few stats for you because we love them. An estimated 75,000 tonnes of just flood debris. And that was everything from building materials, a lot of asbestos, 55 tonnes of asbestos in the initial aftermath, and that's still growing, that number. There are still houses, there are still buildings that haven't even been started to have been repaired yet. So these numbers are ongoing, and that's why I said when I talked about the most costly, that number will grow over the coming years. Car bodies, aeroplanes, hospitality waste, whole cool rooms. I own a hospitality business, and after the 2017 flood, I put my cool room on a trailer so that I could literally lock the door, drive it out of harm's way. I did that, still went underwater, and so because the lock was on there, everything that was in that cool room, the whole cool room, the trailer, gone. So animals. Interesting statistic about Lismore at the height of the flood. We actually had a shark warning in the CBD of Lismore because of all the livestock that had drowned, and we had bull sharks swimming up the river from Ballina, and in the CBD of Lismore, feeding frenzy of sharks on dead animals. But we had mass graves of livestock, dairy cows. Interesting statistics about I get distracted very easily, and I'm sorry. We had one dairy cow, because they're all earmarked and tagged, found alive and well 75 kilometres away from its farm. So cattle can actually, 7 stomachs, actually have the capacity to blow a stomach up with air, and that's how they float. So this one particular dairy cow was found 75 kilometres away. There have been photos on national and international media of cattle on the roofs of buildings. That was very common, but unfortunately as well, many animals died, and that becomes a waste problem. What do you do with hundreds of thousands of carcasses? And this wasn't Lismore-centric. We right next door to Casino, who proclaimed the beef capital. So again, livestock issues and dead animals was a big factor for them. Aeroplanes was really interesting, and as I said again, we thought we were really prepared. Our airport has a particular site where planes are tied down, and again, that was at about 12.5 metres above river height. Got to 14 metres, and you could drive through and see aeroplanes. There was aeroplanes in trees. I use a bit of military language. We had the Major General of the Defence Force come up, and he drove the streets with me and a gentleman that's done tours to Afghanistan and Iraq, and virtually saying this is visually far worse than any of those sites that he'd been to. So you can imagine 75,000 tonnes of rubbish literally pushed onto the streets, and you all know what your own CBDs or high streets look like. This was piles much higher than my head, as far as you could see. So, interesting times. One thing that I don't think is taken into account post-disaster is the trauma of the victims who are involved. And I know, for myself personally, I'll tell a little personal story. I actually live in the CBD behind my business. And when you walk into a disaster zone, you've got two options. And it's pretty much get rid of it all because you never want to see it again, or you try and salvage as much as you can. And I'm in the school of just get rid of the lot. Other people to this day are still going through artworks that their grandmother passed down to them and different things like that. So it's very easy just to say push it all on the street, but these are people's lives that you're dealing with, and it's something that I didn't even think about really, but the emotional toll of literally, and it's the same with bushfires and every other disaster as well, there is a very much an emotional toll that we need to be aware of. This isn't necessarily waste, this is people's livelihoods and lives that are sitting in the street. And it's a really interesting scenario to have to deal with. So what does Lismore do at the moment? You've seen our waste cell. We were one of very few councils that actually process their own waste in the Northern Rivers. But at the moment, all of our waste is going to Ipswich, to the big plant up there, and that's costing us about $2.2 million a year. It's not government funded, that's coming out of our budget, and we're looking at another 2 years before our waste facility is fully functioning again. So we're up to about 4.5 to 5 million just to get rid of our business as usual, our BAU waste, just to get it out of Lismore. So a big cost. And then we're going to need to borrow another $10 to $12 million as a council to upscale. Our government, God love them, any grant funding puts stuff back to how it was, and for what we want to see as a growing, thriving regional centre, what we had is just simply not fit for purpose for where we want to be. So we're going to have to borrow another $10 to $12 million on top of any grant funding that we can to upgrade our waste facility to get it to where we need to be. So it has come at a very heavy cost for the residents of Lismore, for the businesses of Lismore, but also the Council of Lismore. So how prepared were we? We thought we were good. I've never seen anything like it on the 27th of February 2022. I thought my business was good to go. I thought my home was packed up. I'm a lover of cars. I had a 1966 Falcon, a 1979 Mustang, which I parked on the third floor of a multi-level car park across the road. That went underwater, but never before has it ever been underwater. We thought we were prepared, is my point. We thought we were safe. You can't plan or prepare for something like that. As that video showed, that was built to a level of 12.5 metres above river height and totally demolished. So my question to the panel to start the discussion, is anyone really prepared for a disaster? And this is really good because we've got such a good range of people here. Is anyone really prepared for a disaster to strike and to deal with the aftermath of that disaster? And this could be anyone from local government, state government, different agencies, and we've got them all on stage today. And in your own personal experience, are we truly prepared to manage the cleanup and the disposal of waste post-disaster? I'm going to start and we'll work our way down.
For the extent of disasters that we seem to be experiencing, I personally would say that I don't think we would ever be confident that, following our previous experiences, that we are either fully prepared to cope with disaster. At Penrith, I believe we are partially prepared, predominantly due to the experience, especially of the last few years. We have increased the cross-collaboration. Waste is in fact a component of a greater plan, which I know sounds very corporate and everything else, but I would probably say we have even planned to put disaster and recovery waste into our waste contracting. We did it on a very, very minor scale in the previous contract, which allowed us to have increased cooperation, and that was a godsend. I think relationship building is a very soft comment to make about disasters, but it's the relationship building that we were able to build upon that took our waste cleanup to, I suppose, the efficient level that I believe it went to. Penrith as a river city is interesting in that unlike Lismore, the disasters do not cover the entire city, so it's patchy and it doesn't necessarily flood in the same places on different occasions, and it may not only be a major disaster where flooding may occur in the city. The interesting part was, I suppose on a black humour note, is that we've had to do a lot of flood work because our evacuation route flooded in the last flood. So the pace of development in a place like Penrith and the effect of these disasters has also had planning limitations which weren't there before. So coming to terms with forward planning, the forward planners of things that they may have projected and now they need to amend. But going back to waste management, I think most waste services sit often within their engineering department. Ours moves around depending on who's restructuring who at the moment, but we're still quite insular in that we can cope on our own. I suppose the reason I raise that point is that we are acquainted with our LEMO. In a previous role within council, I have been the LEMO. So an understanding of how the local emergency and the state emergency panels stand up and operate, I think is extremely important. And I think it's important for the waste management team to understand what their role can be immediately when that disaster centre stands up and what they can do. I also think the confidence to run a good recovery program is built through your cleanup collection. You can become, very well acquainted with what's going to happen. And I'm very conscious that I'm hogging the microphone. So I'm going to just make one more point, which goes back to what you were saying, Steve. The emotional and empathetic impact is sometimes, I think, beyond our realisation until it happens. For instance, our last flooding disaster 2 was predominantly 2022, and I'm reliably informed that as of this morning, our disaster cleanup took its last cleanup. And that was nowhere near on a scale of yours. That was of the rural area of Londonderry. In those areas, people no longer have insurance, so they're not necessarily of the let's just get rid of it and start again. They do have to be a bit more scrutinising. And at the risk of being told I'm profiling, sometimes the people who live in the, let's say, more rural and remote areas of our municipality live there for a reason, and they don't want people coming onto their property. And the extent of their waste is such that we may need to bring the truck on, and they don't have the capacity to bring it to the curbside, or they don't actually have a curbside, but to bring it out to the front of their property. So we already have things like indemnity for trucks to enter, and acquaint them with that through the recovery centre. Make sure you have a presence at your recovery centre. But I suppose I'm plucking things at random, and I'm very interested to hear what Lismore said. That's the third time I know I've said that to you, and I'm very happy to pass this along the panel. And I can talk forever about waste, so I'm going to now hand it to Tanya.
Thank you, Tracy. It's good to hear that council experience as well. I guess I would say that there was an article out in The Guardian recently that looked at a survey of hundreds of our world's leading climate scientists, and a lot of them have predicted that we're not going to meet our targets, that we're going to be up at 2.5 degrees or greater. And this means that we're not necessarily going to be prepared. It's a trebling of the impacts that we've already seen. And so, the floods will certainly have put the pressure on for us to be more prepared. But we need to be thinking that it's going to be it's going to be more intense again. There's going to be longer duration, disasters and overlapping disasters, and that's what we need to prepare for. So, in WA, just to give an example, I was talking to some representatives over there. Their north and their south bushfire seasons generally happen separately. There's a gap in between. They've been seeing those extended over longer periods of time, and now they're overlapping, which means that the resources that are out there to respond to these disasters are tired. There's no time in between to stop and reflect and to gather themselves, and the recovery efforts and the cleanup is just ongoing. So you've got that real disaster fatigue happening now, and if we think we're tired now, imagine how tired we're going to be when the next one hits. It is probably just a matter of time. So I guess we've got the local experience, the local government experience, but from a state and territory perspective, while there's been additional resources, staff resources put into that recovery response, and lots of funding being channeled into recovery, what there seems to be a lacking in is that integrated planning, that disaster waste contingency planning. It's not formalised enough, it's not available enough. I think a lot of that responsibility is delegated to the local government areas and the councils, and that makes sense to a degree, but there needs to be that oversight, and that we're seeing the regional coordinators and joint organisations sort of take on that role to talk to councils to make sure they're talking to each other, they're mapping their waste flows, they're thinking about the capacity of their infrastructure, shared equipment, that sort of response. But we still need that upper planning element to really come in and help put those levers in place to fast-track approvals and to make sure that we are putting those contingencies in place for logistics, waste flows, making sure we have enough infrastructure, waste and recycling infrastructure, to process this disaster waste, because the quantities are huge. In the Canberra region, after their disaster event, they had a doubling of waste in their region, a doubling of what they would normally generate in 1 year. That's huge. It's huge amounts of waste, and we need to make sure that we've got the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure to sort of handle that.
So I'm going to ask you quickly, Tanya, the statistic, and I've learnt so much in 2.5 years. The statistic going around is that 97% of disaster funding is reactive, happens post-event.
Yep.
Only 3% is spent on proactive measures that you are talking about. How can we shift the focus?
We need to put more into mitigation. I think that that communication at that committee level, like establishing those committees at that regional level, of course within councils, at that regional level, and at that state and territory level, and across all of those state agencies as well, because they all, each disaster is different. It's always going to be that way. So the lead on a response is always going to change to a certain degree, but those groups need to be talking all the time, and we can mandate that they talk more regularly, because I think that's necessary, and that rehearsing of what can be done. But certainly there needs to be more conversation about real mitigation measures, and from a waste perspective, we need to look at our infrastructure. We need more. We need more of those satellite sites as well, those transfer stations, we need more of those formalised MOUs, formalised arrangements to make sure we've got those contingency sites for sorting as well, and for prioritisation of different waste types that are collected and created during different disaster waste events or disaster events. Yeah.
Awesome. Mike, are we ready?
Trying to work out which bits to say and which bits not to.
Let it out, mate.
There are so many thoughts that in a conversation like this. The first thing I sort of would like to say, and I'm sorry, but I never saw them as victims. And one of our staff referred to the people that had lost their houses or half their farms as victims. And because we didn't have HR up at that stage, I introduced her to the concept that she might not be working there too long if she kept referring, because we can't treat them as victims. We have to treat them as humans. That most of these people were sitting around having a cup of tea waiting for Christmas in 2 days, in my case. They got a knock on the door, you got 20 minutes. When they went back, there was nothing. All the Christmas presents, the Christmas tree, the house, the car, everything that was left behind was just a pile of rubble. And we didn't own it, they did. We were just responsible to try and help them clean it up and put them back to a position where they could rebuild their house, which is how we treat them. We ask permission to go on. We ask permission to do this. We ask permission to do that. Even ask permission to go on and remove the rubble or the debris, whatever, once we were ready to do their particular property. So that was just my philosophy, and I think it worked in the Adelaide Hills. It didn't work so well on Kangaroo Island, which is sort of getting to. In the Adelaide Hills, we had a little bit more or a lot more infrastructure. The ideology was, let's recycle as much as we can. Yay, fantastic. You've got piles of rubble half full of asbestos. What am I going to do with that? Right? I'm a recycling guy. That's been my life. I can't recycle stuff full of asbestos, so my ideology sort of goes out the window. So then we have to put a strategy together. How do we maximise recovery, minimise disposal, but be real and hand these back to people? I can't spend 2 years sorting through this stuff. These people want to start rebuilding and getting their lives back in track. So there's all those sorts of things that we have to go through. So I mentioned earlier, I could tell me to shut up when you're ready.
Mate. Keep going.
I mentioned earlier that I helped write the strategy, and I've been in the waste industry in Adelaide longer than I've been out of the waste industry in my life. I know it inside and out. I know every landfill, I know every recycling centre, I know them beyond intimately. I can walk on any of them. I knew them all. I knew what they could take and I knew what they couldn't take, and I knew the whole lot. So we wrote that into our document. So in the Adelaide Hills, we were so well prepared. I knew where the landfill was. The landfills that could take asbestos were a 2.5 hour round trip. The landfill where our asbestos went was a 1 hour round trip, because I knew it. I knew where it was. I knew how I could get there. And I went and had a look at its planning approval. And it wasn't approved to take asbestos, but it was not approved to take asbestos. So I got to with the EPA. And this is a clue. These guys here, in our industry, we often see them as a pan in the what's it. But in this instance, working with them, it was brilliant. I took them, I walked them through the process where I needed to go and how I needed to do it. And they went away and they worked on how they could make it happen. And often that meant they had to go to legal. They had to get their own internal legal advice. Can we do this? And that took a bit of time, but it was time well spent. So we worked out how we could get rid of this stuff as efficiently and as quickly as we could. We worked with the local analytical labs. So we would go around and collect samples from an area. And at 3 o'clock every day, we would meet the guy and he would come and take our samples and off he'd go. And at 6 o'clock every night, I would get a list of which sites had asbestos that I wanted to clean up, which sites didn't. That's the efficiency of having a plan and a strategy in play for somewhere like the Adelaide Hills. Then I want to go to Kangaroo Island. Now, I didn't exactly do Kangaroo Island. It was just too big a job to do the Adelaide Hills and KI. But it'll give you an idea on the difference. KI is an island. It's got a ferry that goes across. There's no road. Everything that goes in and goes out goes in and out on ferry. And there was thousands of tonnes and lots of asbestos. And a landfill that was exhausted. Probably had half a dozen years left in it at normal use. So we had to work out what we could do with all of this material. From an ideological perspective, how do we recycle that? From a realistic perspective, we dug a thumping great hole, we made sure it was secure, and we buried the lot. Totally different to what we were able to do in the Adelaide Hills. So I guess one of the things that I'm going to say, and some people may or may not like this, it's not one size fits all. You have to understand, and your strategy needs to be set up on a regional basis. So when you are putting together your disaster waste management plans, you might have to be realistic and say, at this point here, I'm just going to bury it. There's a very smart observation of yours. We maybe just need to dig a hole and bury it. And as a recycling guy, in my history, I often calculate it. I think programs I've worked on, things I've done, I'm well over 50, 60 million tonne of recycling in Australia as a result of a lot of the programs I've worked on. So I'm not a landfill guy, I'm not a disposal guy, but I'm also realistic. And in disasters, realism is where we need to come from rather than ideology. I think I've wrapped it up.
You've done well, and it's a great segue into Susan, I'm from a very small joint organisation. I heard you mention you've got 11 councils and a heavily densely populated joint organisation. So how's the Hunter based?
Yeah, so the Hunter's got a real mix. So you've got obviously some really smaller, more rural councils, less well-resourced. And then you've got some more urban metro councils such as Newcastle, Lake Mark. So very, very diverse, really. And as part of the project, I did visit all of the councils. And my experience is that some are prepared better than others, obviously, as you would expect. And I think if I could say what the difference was in why some were better prepared than others, and I would say that was previous exposure to an event was the factor, because like you said, you know, you moved your car to the 3rd floor, and it's that thinking, whereas councils that perhaps hadn't had recent exposure were less likely to go there. They were in that peacetime mind frame. They couldn't quite stretch to thinking about this, you know, the scale that you showed us. I feel like people just couldn't go there maybe, and I was trying to say to them, but what would you do? What would you do if your landfill was completely inaccessible? You know, just sort of trying to trigger that thinking. And I think it's really hard for people to go there unless they've actually been there. So I'd say exposure is a big thing, and I think if we are going to become more exposed and more frequent, then that could be the way we get more prepared. Because as humans, we just don't like to think about the bad stuff, and we're very short memories in that respect. And then you say, and I understand the barrier, and you definitely want to help those communities recover as soon as possible. But the issue is some councils have only got 5 years landfill, and that's based on their business as usual. They're not accounting to use 2 years in one event. So there's that, and then obviously a lot of councils, you know, they're being pushed to be as efficient as possible. So they're literally just, you know, working their butts off to just do business as usual, and they don't have the resources to think about this and to prepare for a maybe, especially when there's competing things for public money and where that's spent.
It's an interesting point you raised, that you know, that life cycle of a waste cell. Some councillors are quickly running out, and as an elected official myself, it's really hard to think legacy items, and it's not a vote grabber. You know, I'm going to build a new waste cell, and it's going to last us 20 years. Vote for me. Compared to someone else I'm going to pave the streets with the best concrete I drive on the roads. I don't give a shit about where my waste goes. So it's really hard to sell that to the voting public. But is there any, I know individual councils have their own plans and their own guidelines and stuff. As a JO, is there a collaboration? If Newcastle had the earthquake in 1980s or whatever it was, is Cessnock, for example, prepared to help out in their waste removal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the region has got a really good track record of helping each other out, I have to say. You know, they do that informally anyway. And what we are doing with our disaster waste management plan is putting that in paper, if you like, and we're going to attach a memorandum of understanding to that, so that, you know, there is that sort of recognised willingness to share and help. Obviously, councils still want to be able to prioritise their own operations, but where they can help, they will. That already exists, and this is just a case of like formalising the already informal. And yeah, because, you know, disasters don't stick to boundaries, so
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly right. That's a perfect point, is that our flood did not stop at the Lismore LGA boundary. It covered 7 LGAs, and the cross-communication collaboration, not only from our JO, but from the state and from the country, was amazing. But lessons learned for us is that as a JO, we want to be able to support and help wherever we can. So those MOUs are very important moving forward. Oh, we're going backwards.
Who owned that waste? If it started off in Lismore and it washed down to the next council, who was responsible for owning the waste, the next council or this council? And that's an issue with a flood. We didn't have it with the fire. I'm pretty sure that we've got it in South Australia or Murray at the minute. Who owns it? And that is, I didn't say it, but that's one of the reasons that we took ownership. Sorry, it's one of the reasons we took ownership of the waste. Our contractors did not pay disposal. We paid disposal because that took out who owned the waste and who was responsible for it, which district. Anyway, sorry.
This is like it's rehearsed almost, because what a brilliant segue into the EPA, who, you're 100% right, Mike. You know, our waste washed down the river to Ballina. But I'll lead into Christy, and we'll come back to that in more detail in a minute. But Christy, as far as an organisation, and I can only speak for Lismore City Council, even to this day, 2.5 years on, our relationship with the EPA has never been better. And we have this fear of state government or authorities in local government coming over the top of us and telling us what to do, not working with us. I've got to say, our Lismore experience is the EPA has been and are ongoing, still to this day, been fantastic in finding solutions for us and helping us in regards to a regional waste problem. We had waste, believe it or not, Mike, coming down from other LGAs to us. So the regional approach was very much predominant, but as an organisation, you deal with these sorts of things on a far too regular basis, sadly. What's your preparedness model look like?
Yeah, so I think this is a big question, and are we ready? And I think it really depends on so many factors, but also we have to think about the scale of what's happened in the last, since 2019, we've been in repeat disasters, COVID, bushfires, floods. And I think, we all have finite resources, and across the emergency management spectrum, if you look at the principles around prevention, preparedness, response and recovery, they all intermingle, and we've only got finite resources to deal with that. And we've really been in response and recovery since the 2019 bushfires. And speaking with councils, there's a lot of preparedness work to do, but some are still trying to recover, and they've only got so much capacity and time to do that, or even to run grant programs to build that prevention and preparedness piece. So I think we have been in unique times, and I'm sure that's going to continue, but we had recent flooding in the last month, and I suppose so many factors feed into this, but in the waste space, if we're looking at that today, we've had recent flooding just last month. Much smaller scale, we're immediately able to, I can see Kieran, one of our data people in the back, waive the waste levy, get temporary sites up, move approvals around and get that cleaned up quite quickly, get drones out to assess damage and amount of impact in the rivers because of our experience in the larger events. And I think continuous improvement is one of the principles in emergency management. And I think there's a lot of after action reviews and work going into now, we've had 2 flood inquiries. What's the next steps? How do we be better prepared? How do we work in the prevention space? And I think there is a lot of energy. They talk about it in peacetime. I don't love that term, but they really talk about it in peacetime and emergency management. A lot of effort is going now into that preparedness and prevention piece. We redid the disaster waste sub-plan that sits under the emergency management plan last year, added an extra around temporary storage. And as you can see, there's a lot of funding from the state and really a Commonwealth level looking at that preparedness and prevention piece. So if we had another flood the size of, the really big one in Lismore, it was 2 metres, I think, above what you were prepared for. We're probably not ready yet. We're still recovering. But for smaller scale disasters, I think we are getting ready in that space. I worked a lot in waste, and I've only moved more recently in the last couple of years into emergency management, and the governance structures that exist in that space are quite remarkable. The work that goes into preparedness in just responding and pulling resources across agencies into response with combat agencies and the like, it is really quite remarkable, and the better we respond, the less long-term impacts there would be. So I think there's lots of aspects to it. If I could just comment on the point you made about the emotional impact earlier. One of the things we learnt from the bushfires is around that, about calling things waste when they're people's personal belongings. And so we've tried to move to saying flood debris, which probably isn't even the best way to do it either. But that emotional response, I just wanted to comment on that as well.
It's something, as I said, it's a little bit personal for me. And
Yeah, 100%.
I could tell you stories about what we lost. And I might if we've got time. But I want you to hold the microphone for the minute, Christy.
Could I just comment, Kieran, I hope I get this right, but when we're talking about the volumes of waste, I think there was 340,000 tonnes just cleaned up in the initial aspects of bushfires and 40,000 more in floods. So it's a remarkable amount of waste that we're managing.
It is, and I was interested in your comment. We very much take on military terms like peacetime and different things. And my next question is framed in and around that. During peacetime, waste through the EPA is very controlled. We all know it. It's a very controlled and regulated industry. But during a post-disaster, this becomes very uncontrolled. And in my experience, uncontrollable. You can't control it. So in the wake of a disaster, how can we better manage the handling of waste? And in a lot of respects, and I'll give you one example, asbestos was a big problem in Lismore, and there are opportunists who weren't necessarily flood victims that saw the opportunity to sneak down at night. You've got to remember, Lismore had nothing. In the early stages, no power, no running water, all of the things that we take for granted, no mobile reception, you're right, all of those sorts of things. It was eerie. It was actually really scary as soon as the sun went down, but you could see headlights and trailers and different things. The amount of illegal waste in that statistic, people that weren't flood victims that saw the opportunity to maybe gut the asbestos out of their place that they were looking at renovating and dumping on the side of the road, it's probably a no real answer question, but how can we control those sorts of things? And I've got to give a shout out to the EPA. I told you I get easily sidetracked, but EPA officers were going out to farms, helping farmers bury their dead livestock and doing all of those sorts of things, making sure that was all done to as best as possible. Practice is probably the best term. As Mike said, sometimes you just got to dig a big hole in the ground and bury it and hope for the best. But where do we stand? And we'll start with you again, Christy. How do we manage the handling of waste after a disaster?
Yeah, so I think it's some of the similar things I've mentioned. We look to our plans and our structures and our responses. So we have disaster waste management plans in place, and regions have that as well. And now we're looking at having pre-identified temporary waste sites and the like. I think possibly the volumes of waste are uncontrollable, and there's always these new factors that come up. But in an emergency, you have, as you all know, incident management teams sitting there, so you have the right people ready to make really quick decisions. So when things like asbestos and other issues come up, you have the right people at the table to be able to quickly respond to those issues that you don't always have in place in normal times. So I think while it is uncontrollable, there are systems in place to quickly respond, and very quickly respond to new issues as they arise and to deal with those. Environmental impacts during disasters are still front of mind for the EPA, and even when we're setting up temporary sites, we require record keeping and controls in place around dust and noise and environmental impacts. So it's not like environmental controls get thrown out of the window. It's just that we're in a very different time, and normal regulatory approaches aren't applicable with huge amounts of waste coming through, and we need to be able to respond and be adaptive and flexible in how we manage those things. So I think there will always be, every incident is different. Bushfires consume a lot of waste, floods, you've got a lot of long-term impacts. So I think, again, we learn as we go, but I think there are plans and measures and systems in place to manage that waste as it comes along. And I think in Lismore we set up a temporary asbestos storage site to allow people to bring the asbestos there. With the legal aspect, we're always struggling. Everyone would have talked about this through the last few days with waste management behaviours, and there's always going to be an element of that. We've had funded a legal dumping program specifically in relation to bushfire and floods, to try to manage the legal dumping that happens sometimes further down the line when people start cleaning out their houses and the like. But that opportunistic aspect will always be there. I hope that helps.
No, fantastic. And we'll move on. Susan, as a JO, what sort of things, I'll waffle a little bit and I apologise. Climate and change are two words that are used heavily in the wake of a disaster. Is it possible to plan, and I know we touched on it a little bit through individual councils and joint organisations, so what possible strategies to handle disaster waste, and how do we then weigh up all of those forces, be they environmental or social or economic, to deal with future potential disasters? I know it's a long and convoluted question. How do we plan to prepare to deal with this?
I think we can plan. I think if there is the will and the resources and the backing, we can. As humans, we decide what the priorities are, we make the rules. And I unfortunately think it's only going to be through repeated, catastrophic exposure that we'll really get to that place, unfortunately. But I think then we can go, right, this is clearly something we're going to have to continuously deal with. I think we've all got to rethink what the 1 in 100 year event is. It's not going to be 1 in 100 years anymore. But I think we can plan, but it just needs to be, it's when the prevalence of disasters becomes such a focal point for everybody that will then go, right, well, what are we going to do about this, and really resource it and prepare it, because at the moment I feel like it still falls in a bit of a just in case kind of thing. And certainly with our temporary transfer sites that we're trying to look at in the region, it's really tricky because they are temporary transfer sites, so they're currently, for instance, maybe a disused landfill, it could be a car park, it could be a sports field, and they will stay that until they're ready to be used. And at the moment, we've hit a bit of a roadblock with trying to get temporary transfer sites sort of ready to be stood up, because they're not prepared to be licensed to deal with problem wastes, and they're more sort of, I suppose, to aid resource recovery. But we've hit this block where because we're trying to pre-plan it, the instruments, planning instruments and the legislation isn't there to back it up. So we probably need to look at that as well, to how do we enable, you know, to prepare and fund it and everything. And, you know, another big one is obviously addressing contamination. So much has to go to landfill because it's contaminated, so we might need to get the scientists in on how we clean that up, and because we will run out of landfill.
As Susan said, I'm coming to you now, Mike. It takes repeated major events to really wake up every level of government to spring into action and to literally change legislation. Given the apathy in and around, you know, if we don't have another major event for a few years, it's very easy. And I know Lismore itself, 2.5 years post-flood, it's very easy to forget how bad the situation was. Given the apathy in and around us as humans, how can we keep those plans active and alive and fit for purpose moving forward? Kangaroo Island and the Adelaide Hills, I remember well. I love Adelaide Hills wine, and I was devastated when I saw some of my favourite vineyards go up in smoke. But, you know, it's 4 years on now, and the vines are back, the wine's flowing again. How do we maintain that need for preparedness in people's minds?
That's a great question. And at the risk of being controversial, we got to stop listening to the wrong people, and we got to start listening to the people that know what they're talking about. And if I had one person tell me in the Adelaide Hills that they'd known for 10 years this was coming, I had 100. Little interest. In January, we hit the hills to start doing the pre-clean-up activities of working out what was what and where everything was. And in February, the government pulled all of the recovery agencies out of the Adelaide Hills due to COVID. And they rang me and said, "What are you doing, Mike?" I said, "I'm cleaning up the hills." They said, "Well, we pulled all our staff out from COVID." I said, "Yeah, I hear that." So they said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "I'm cleaning up the Adelaide Hills." And I went to all the contractors and I said, "You can walk away now, I don't mind, and I'll respect your decision, or you can stay with me." And they stayed. But what that meant was I then became the only senior person in their minds from the government, and I wasn't a government guy, in the Adelaide Hills. So people would talk to me. And what they were telling me was, they were telling the government this was coming. They were telling the forestry industry this was coming. But the forestry industry and the government listened to the Greens, and they wouldn't clean up properly, and they wouldn't clean up the undergrowth, and they wouldn't manage the forest the way the forest needed to be done. Now, I'm currently working in the Hunter on restarting a power station on biomass. So I'm back working, and we're not going to do any forestry waste. And the reason is because we can't get evidently public licence, we can't get government approval, we can't get government agreement. And we get that, we're working through another avenue. But what I'm saying there is, we haven't learned. We are still going to allow our forests to overgrow. We are still going to allow them to get a feedstock. And I could show you pictures, I wasn't allowed to bring them, but I could show you pictures of where the fire went through and the canopy was intact. It was cooked from the heat, but it was not actually burnt. And it ran through the ground and it ran through the undergrowth. And when it went through, it was doing 60, 70 miles an hour. And when it's doing that pace, it actually creates its own weather patterns. So nobody had a clue which way it was going to go and how it was going to go there. And we haven't learned. We're still listening to the wrong people. So as controversial as I can not try to be, I'm going to be that controversial. And I'm going to say, if we are going to manage this into the future, we've got two options. We either manage the forests and the area properly to minimise the damage, or we stop living in areas where we have mismanaged forests. There are two options. I hope that was okay.
That was very uncontroversial. Tanya, as an environmental consultant, you would see it exactly what Mike's sort of talking about in a lot of respects.
Yeah,
how
I
do you
mean-
feel? Like,
I would say we saw fires rushing across, grassland and agricultural sort of grass areas as well. But yes, there is that mitigation element. For me, it's about communication again. Really understanding the triggers for when different responses are coming in. So when is the disaster declaration? When are the feds coming in? When are the different state agencies coming in? What are the eligibility criteria from that response point of view? What are the different eligibility criteria? Making sure that each of the agencies understand exactly where they stand and where they fit. There's a big side to this, which is emissions reduction, better design of houses, and better planning and better communication of the risks to people when they purchase a property, better understanding of that risk. I think there could be better education to make us more aware of the risk, but also our response and our shared responsibility, but that this is a wartime effort response. It actually is. And we all need to be prepared. So to be on the front foot, we need to be talking to each other and communicating that. And maybe we need a big education program, but balanced. So we have that local-led approach to make people a bit more aware of it.
and Tracy, you're still young, you've still got decades left in the local government area.
I'll happily just take the segue on education, if you like.
Feel free.
I was sitting here thinking that I couldn't help but think about what the theme of the conference is, and looking out in the audience, I do see some very well qualified and educators that I'm aware of. I'm not saying it's all education, but I do think that this problem has the two facets. There's all the issues that we're talking about at strategy, at preparedness level, but there is still always that bell curve of people who are early adopters or not, or people who are coming online. And yes, we need to give them common messages, but I think the other thing is that if I am only looking as part of a team for waste, then I need people to be growing in responsibility. So yes, I don't want them to be sitting at home thinking, well, the government should come and help me, and I don't care if it's federal, state, local. The fact is they should come and help me. I need help. I need this rubbish gone. And if I don't have an overall disaster, and I have LGA where I have I hate the term, but let's say a pocket disaster where I do have a declaration under the Act in one component, and yet I've got 40,000 residents on the other side of the river who haven't chosen to live there, and we didn't choose to live there, so why is my garbage service on time? And I feel sorry for those poor people, but then I think there is a parallel campaign that we can look at to perhaps maybe not enforce it, but grow the responsibility of the individual resident of their preparedness. And I think local government is one of the best places to do that. I feel that may not be, it's totally different to what Mike's saying. I don't want to make that sound controversial, and I don't want to make it sound unimportant, because I am sitting here thinking the scale of the disaster in Lismore, if someone said, well, I did my local education and, it just didn't hurt. But the disasters will vary in size, magnitude, type, what people can and can't do, and the type of resident, where they live, what they live on. And I do think we just need to be more open and sharing with what they can do in order to contribute when something starts to happen. And if that program means that this is the point where they call on the government, or they can expect to get government help, but maybe there's a time now to say, look, some of us, we just really got to start taking a bit of responsibility for ourselves in what we do, what we purchase, how we go about it.
Thank you, and thanks to our panellists. We've got 15 minutes before you can go and pop a Panadol and get a coffee into you after last night. And I like to be a bit more interactive, so Kate's up the back with a microphone. If there are any questions for the panellists that you have a burning desire to ask, now's the time. Yes, up the back, and then we'll come to you, sir. Just over here.
Sam from Hawkesbury. Obviously, we've been experiencing multiple disasters. We did have a small-scale event, and I have to credit the EPA did do a wonderful thing and work with our team around temporary transfer stations and exemptions. The exemption or the wonderful declaration that there's no waste levy created significant headache within our organisation, because while the EPA may have waived $163.20, the state or federal government to pay for the disaster waste at that stage has not agreed to pay for the rest. So there's obviously a funding component for us to manage around finances, but I think my question's more around, you know, we sort of talked around this conference around design and sort of looking up, and obviously in disasters we think about prevention. So what ideas can we either encourage or fund to look at that prevention aspect? I mean, one thing that was spoken about is asbestos. So should there be a dedicated program across these areas where we are pulling out asbestos pre-event? So we know that in a fire, these are already free of asbestos, so therefore the cleanup's going to make more sense.
Good question. And who wants to tackle that?
I'll have a go at tackling that. Well, we do lead the NAC, the Asbestos Coordination Committee, the National Asbestos Coordination Committee, and I can't speak to all their actions, but there is prevention work happening in that bigger asbestos space. But I do agree with you, we need to be looking very broadly. You know, this crosses a lot of angles. One of the things we are working at is, so post bushfires, we did a recovery program with local Aboriginal land councils to fix asbestos and legacy asbestos on some of their land, so that next time a bushfire comes through, we don't have the same issues. So there is some programs in place to look at that prevention piece and try to prevent those things happening again in the asbestos space. But I agree with you, there's a lot of work to be done broadly.
And if I can just chip in there a little, one thing that I've learnt, that with the inbuilt resilience coming post-disaster in Lismore, you know, asbestos was a problem, it's gone now. But buildings are getting built back to a standard that is far better than what they were pre-2022. So it's the ongoing recovery program in and around not only getting rid of it before the disaster, but making sure that those standards are better post-disaster as well.
Could I just add one other thing, sorry, and then I'll pass on. So obviously one of the other disasters we had was the Wickham fires, the massive, I live in Wickham, so I know the massive fires there with asbestos going across the community from the fires. And so one of the projects we've got in relation to that now is looking at Super 6 roofing. So I was just saying we are continually learning and trying to implement those things.
I'll comment on a few things that I've read about and talked about, but you know, in WA they are looking at, for cyclones example, they're making landfall further south than they would usually or historically have experienced, and they've got communities there that haven't got cyclone-proof buildings, so it's thinking not historically, but what might happen in the future. Do we need to be more ready? So, you know, making sure that they're ready for that kind of change to occur. They're planting, you know, wind-tolerant tree species and that sort of thing to help as well to prevent, you know, all the hazardous tree sort of fall that happen in those areas. So there's those kind of measures, but levies and, you know, just understanding exactly where those risks are, I think, communicating that to people so that they know that if they're in a risk zone, they may have to up and leave.
Yeah, exactly. Down here, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much. Richard Plant from Recycling Victoria. I've had 10 years in emergency management and just stepped into the waste sector, so I'm coming up from the other perspective. First comment would be to Steve is congratulations on supporting your community. You were available on ABC radio in Melbourne, really advocating for the support to your community during the floods, and then I think it's fantastic that you've stayed around after to continue to build the resilience, because there's nothing like a lived experience to make that work. My question relates to the two authorities. So no one's yet mentioned the role of Resilience New South Wales or the role of Disaster Recovery New South Wales in supporting preparedness and response. I've got lots of other questions, but I might leave it at that.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty well documented. Those agencies were an unmitigating failure in our instance. As I said, I could stand here all day and tell you some personal stories of my dealings with some of the bureaucrats in charge of those organisations, and really the lack of scope and understanding of what we were really dealing with. You can't channel these into a manual and pull out a manual and expect everything to be sequential and ordered and 9 to 5. I mean, in Lismore, we stood up 2 emergency evacuation centres, and I'll just share one quick story with you. One housing 1,200 odd people and another housing 800 odd people. The first Resilience New South Wales staff member to come was probably 6 days after the flood, 8:30 in the morning, asked where they could put their handbag and where is the urn for their cups of tea and what time was morning tea. And in amongst all of that, our emergency evacuation centre was dealing with setting up methadone rooms and people that were literally in their pyjamas, because our evacuations occurred predominantly 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. So they were literally still in their mud-ridden pyjamas, false teeth were missing, all those sorts of things, and the response was simply inadequate. Having said that, that has led to legislative change to introduce the Reconstruction Authority, which again has had its teething problems. It's a brand new authority. Having said that, their new, at the moment, acting CEO, we hope that he will get that role full time, but there's some other things at work at the moment. But Mal Lanyon, who was Deputy Commissioner of Police and put in charge of emergency recovery post-flood, he was there from day one, is now the acting CEO of that organisation. I have full confidence in the work that they will do. Having known Mal for now 2.5 years and worked pretty closely with him, I think New South Wales is on the right track. We're still 12 years behind Queensland with their QRA, and living so close to the border as well, one of our great anxieties is seeing how fast Queensland reacts and responds. And you've got to temper expectation, because we're dealing with an authority that is brand new, is still finding their feet. Queensland have got a 12-year jump on us in that space. But I'm confident with the correct leadership in place now that New South Wales will catch up pretty quick. I'm also confident in NEMA. NEMA poached Brendan Moon, who set up the QRA originally, and now he's in charge of the federal organisation. So I think the hierarchy, it's taken a while, but I think we're getting there.
Can I just add to that as well, that I think talking to the states and territories, that they usually like to get their separate houses in order first before sort of sharing more widely. But I think given what we know, it warrants a talk now, like that, sharing of information and lessons learned right now, and so we can all sort of progress together rather than waiting. It's sort of, we need that urgency. So yes, the newer authorities, they should be talking to the other states and territories.
One thing I'm advocating for, and I'm in a pretty fortunate position, as you said, Lismore was in the spotlight there for a number of months, and I got to know Brendan Moon pretty well, and I know Mal Lanyon pretty well, and I'm advocating through both of those gentlemen that we develop a federal sort of a hierarchy, because we've all mentioned disaster knows no borders. You know, the event that hit us also hit southeast Queensland, you know, and our great frustration is seeing the rollout of the Queensland government response compared to what New South Wales is doing, and we need to get better in that space, and it's as simple as that.
And training, so we did receive training in the program, but training, understanding how to approach disaster fatigued people, even if you're disaster fatigued yourself, just having that base training across all levels, whoever is responding to a call, so that you know better what you're going in for and how to treat people.
Yep, we've got time for one last question down the front here.
That's okay.
Thanks, Kate, you're doing well.
Hi, Bron Elliott from ABC Waste Consultants. I'm also a member of the Byron Shire, and we set up the flood hub for our community. I'm part of the Byron Tweed Community Resilience Network, which connects straight into the Tweed Byron Local Emergency Management Committee. So there's a lot of grassroots stuff happening, and communities driving a lot of this, as was seen by the response activities during the floods in 2022. I sit with two hats, like many of you do, from a recovery, response, preparedness perspective, and also a long-term waste background. And one thing that the hierarchy is great, Steve, but at a grassroots level, we need grassroots support, because community is going to come back and do it again. And there's some short-term approaching to support that, but there's nothing long-term. So Byron's about to lose their resource recovery officer, and that for us is a huge gap. We then have nowhere to go. We as community then have to pick up extra slack into that. There was no waste preparedness. I've talked about this before with council, so they sort of know, but in terms of being prepared from a waste perspective, we have a long way to go towards that. But it's not just waste. It's community, it's having that resource within council, and it's having that recognised at a state level and heavily funded, so that we at a grassroots level can do what it is we need to do. Because when the shit hits the fan, and it will again, as we know, we need to be supported, prepared, and a lot of the attention at the moment is about recovery, and we're still all in recovery, but there's not enough attention being given to preparedness at all, be it around waste or anything else. So my question really is to the state government, I guess, but also at a council level and at a regional level, how do we get these officers on the ground that support community, that provide that gap between the hierarchy and what's actually happening on the ground level?
I might like to answer that. At the risk of sounding very parochially South Australian, we actually have a disaster plan at the top. And we're just a portion of it. Where's the disaster waste management? So we're slightly after that. And when we wrote our disaster waste management plan, our disaster strategy, we would go into meetings with the hierarchies from each of the major SAMBOs, fire, country fire, a whole raft, the army, or the armed forces, whatever. They were all there. And what we did was we came up with a disaster plan on who was stepping in at what stage and how it was going to work. And so when that bushfires went through, the fire brigade did their bit. And then they handed it over to the police, and the first responders went in and cleared it all, that there was nothing there that we shouldn't see or we shouldn't find it, so to speak. And they put tags on the front of everything, and it was just all ticked into play, and it worked. So by the time we got there, we had our disaster plan. So we were able to fit into a strategy that was developed. Now, sometimes it works and sometimes it needs a little bit of tweaking. Like I said, no two events are the same. I didn't have to deal with disease from floodwater when I cleaned up the bushfires, but they're now having to do that in the Murray. They're having to deal with mosquitoes, and we didn't have to deal with those. But the principles are what I'm talking about. So sometimes it's left. I always amuse as a waste guy, it's always the waste issue. Like, we'll pass the waste industry, they'll deal with it. Well, it's not a waste issue. This is a whole raft of areas that need to be put into play. I read an article in the paper the other day about our armed forces being used in disaster waste during peacetime. What a waste of their time. Absolute bollocks. And I've cleaned that up. Because the armed forces, when they went through the middle of Loberthal, the community's heart lifted. Not only that, but they were out there helping. And I remember them coming up to me and saying, Mike, where can we help? What can we do? How can we? And they were in a uniform that made our community feel, or that community feel safe. So I'm just going to put that out there. It's a whole of government, whole of community, and disaster waste is just the bit at the bottom.
Absolutely.
It's not the bit that needs to be really addressed. And I'm hearing you about how Queensland have got their stuff rolled out. South Australia had a couple of really visionary senior managers and I've mentioned Vaughan, but there was a few others who got together and said, we need to have a strategy because we don't have one. And that was about 3 or 4 years prior to the Adelaide Hills and Kangaroo Island and the Southeast and the York Peninsula. And we just did it because we had it in play and it started at a high level of government and we were just a bit at the bottom. We weren't it.
I think the event that we had was so extensive that the Northern Rivers was just completely, you know, it was a very huge area. I think you had to be there to really understand the enormity of what it was. The Army came with their brand new little bags and mostly they wouldn't do anything for us. So we actually had the opposite story in many of our communities. They wouldn't, they had specific tasks and they was very focused, and anything outside of that they just wouldn't do. So we had a really different story. But there is a regional plan, but at community level there's not. And so you've got all these little hubs. We're all little hubs. We developed an alliance. I actually wrote Lismore's waste strategy. It was sitting on the desk waiting to be enacted by council just before the floods came in. So I understand the waste story, and I understand the waste story for the Northern Rivers. But from a community point of view, we have a whole lot of little villages that get isolated from each other, and there's no plan, and we're all trying to develop our plans, but we don't have the funding or the resources, and we're all burnt out. You know, we all have jobs, and this is a voluntary thing that is taking up probably more of our time than our everyday job. So we need support at a community level because that's where it will be needed again. And so the planning is important, but we can't all just keep writing our own plans. We actually need some support at a higher level so that we're not actually all reinventing the wheel.
And I think...
And that's what's really needed support.
And I think it comes back to the point of the apathy at all levels of government and some bureaucracies that, you know, 2.5 years on, you can drive through Lismore now or Byron now or Mullumbimby now and not really, unless you go searching, not really notice how devastating the flooding was. So it's about maintaining that. And I get back to the hierarchy because I am a big believer that finally New South Wales has got the right person in the role. Brendan Moon through NEMA, we've got people on the ground, NEMA staff based in the Northern Rivers to help you do that. And I think our New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, and I'm going to be controversial as well, Mike, they were set up and designed by bureaucrats, and we all know that bureaucrats simply don't get it. Having a Deputy Commissioner of Police who is hands-on on the ground, he comes from a structure of if an order's given, you do it. I think that's the right model for a unit like the Reconstruction Authority because we want to see action. We don't want to listen to talk and we don't want to see strategies rolled out one after another. We actually want to see active plans that can be implemented at any time across any region. But I think the cross-collaboration between states is critical so that there's a national approach as well. And we've hit after 11 o'clock. We could talk all day. I know we could. It's a very interesting topic, but I really want to thank our panel members, Tracy, Tanya, Mike, Susan and Christy, for joining us today. A wealth of knowledge, far more intelligent than I would ever aspire to be. But thank you very much, panellists, for your contributions. If we could give them a clap.